Slavery, the scourge of humanity, has likely plagued us since times immemorial. Treating humans as objects, as merchandise, has been a lucrative business for thousands of years. One of the most recent and infamous cases, though, one that still shapes the world we live in today, was the African slave trade with the Americas. Yeah, this episode ain't controversial at all, but we'll talk about it anyway. Hi, my name is Sebastian, and you're watching History in 7 Facts. The inhuman practice of trading African slaves to American plantation owners began sometime in the mid-1400s, and by the 18th century it reached its frightening peaks. It is estimated that a total of 12.5 million Africans were captured, shackled and shipped to the Americas to work in unimaginably horrid conditions on so-called cash crop plantations. What are those, you ask? Only the best things money could buy back then, things like coffee, cocoa, cotton or tobacco, and above all the most prized jewel, sugar. It was the allure of these luxurious products that motivated certain merchants to venture to Africa and acquire slaves, mostly through barter. Along West Africa's Gold Coast, over 30 slave forts were built by the British, the French, the Portuguese and even the Swedes and Danes, creating a very lucrative network of slave ports that spanned over 3,200 kilometers from the Senegal River in the north to Angola, Senegambia and Benin. But, despite what many people think today, slavery was not invented or brought to Africa by Europeans. This practice was already a component of the economic and societal structure of Africa way before the arrival of European traders. For example, the women and children whose husbands or fathers had been killed in battles were often taken as slaves. In many of these cases, though, they sort of became part of the extended family of a tribal chief. In East Africa, the slave trade had a long tradition. For centuries, captured slaves had been transported north through the Sahara Desert and east to Arabia, the Middle East and India by Arab and Ottoman slave traders. It was on this basis that the Euro-American slave trade began. Make no mistake, African chiefs were complicit, as they were the ones who provided slaves to European navigators. At the same time, though, they didn't want Europeans to settle within the continent or interfere too much in local affairs. Europeans themselves were discouraged from doing so due to the well-known difficulties of traveling within Africa and of course the dangers of some pretty nasty diseases. Therefore, Europeans leased land along the coastline to build trading forts, while African slavers captured other Africans in raids or battles, transported them to those forts and sold them as commodities to European merchants. Some African leaders were particularly cooperative. Take the King of Dahomey, for instance, Agaja Trudeau, who in 1726 suggested that Europeans create plantations right there in his kingdom, while he would provide the slaves to work the fields. So yes, the African slave trade wasn't monopolized by Europeans, but was shared with local African strongmen. Remember, all of this began before the infamous scramble for Africa, so most of the continent was still independent and not colonized. Most often, the unfortunate captured souls were brought in exchange for typical European goods like firearms or even alcohol. Sometimes, though, the ships would regularly pass along the Gold Coast in the hopes that they might acquire some batches directly from private traders bypassing the forts. Trading companies, shareholders, captains, and other businessmen involved in the trade were unscrupulous. For them, all of this was just business. Slaves were nothing more than the gears of a very well-organized and extremely profitable economic scheme. To give you an idea of how lucrative the slave trade was, know that in the 1780s the plantations found on the French colony of Saint-Domingue alone, today's Haiti, supplied 40% of the sugar and 60% of the coffee consumed in Europe. These were still luxury items, so as you can imagine, these brought an obscene amount of wealth to everyone involved. However, for this formidable wealth, millions of slaves had to pay a mighty high price. The route they followed to America is known as the Middle Passage, and it was an unimaginable horror. From the 16th up to the 19th centuries, around 54,000 commercial voyages were recorded. An especially prolific period was the 1780s, when 78,000 slaves were sold annually. Half of those belonged to British ships. This journey to South, Central, or North America lasted on average for 10 weeks. Each ship could fit anywhere between 140 and 600 slaves in cramped and just plainly horrifying conditions. Men were chained together in a suffocating space between the deck and the holding area. Women were usually unchained and were allowed on deck, not out of any sentiment of goodness, but to put them to work. Most of these women, though, were harassed and sexually assaulted. Hygiene on board these ships was rudimentary at best. Few ships were equipped with proper facilities for physiological needs. This was especially difficult for the men because they were all chained together, so contracting disease like dysentery or smallpox was pretty much unavoidable. It's hard to calculate how many people died from disease or malnutrition, not to mention the brutal beatings, but a very rough average mortality rate would be between 10 and 25%. After just a month at sea, a slave ship would reek of sweat, urine, feces, and vomit. It got so bad that it was said that you could smell a slave ship from the shore 2 days before it arrived in port. Every morning the slaves were dragged onto the deck for inspection. Anyone that had died overnight was simply thrown overboard. Food rations were meager and included starchy foods like boiled beans, potatoes, biscuits, rice, and rarely dried meats of some sort. One bucket of food was always shared among several people, which of course led to disputes and conflicts, but also contamination with disease. And it wasn't only the slaves that fell victims to disease. Crew members and even captains often fell ill and died. This got to ridiculously high rates at one point. In 1787, for instance, less than half of the slave ship sailors that departed from Liverpool actually returned alive. But no matter how harsh were the conditions for the sailors, I wouldn't pity them too much. No matter what, if they survived, they got to go home. But for the unfortunate captives, their transatlantic journey was only the beginning of their ordeals. Upon arrival in places like Brazil or some Caribbean island, the slaves were then sold at auction like cattle and delivered to their new owners. This was often followed by a period of, let's say, acclimatization, lasting for around a year. In that year, they either died from disease or exhaustion, or survived to lead a life of bondage and misery. Those who survived spent their entire lives doing very hard labor, having zero rights, being split from their families, beaten, and a bunch of other humiliations. Records show that between 1450 and 1700, 2 million Africans were transformed into slaves. Then in the next 100 years, that number increased to at least 6 million. If we take into account the people who died on their way to the forts and on the ships, the number is likely closer to 12 million. England finally abolished slavery in 1807 after years of campaigning by anti-slavery groups. A leading figure was Thomas Clarkson, a prominent abolitionist in England who gathered both physical evidence and also oral accounts from former slave ship captains to expose the horror of the slave trade. The fight gained momentum when it won over the support of people like William Wilberforce, a British MP. The abolition of the Slave Trade Act became law in the British Empire in 1807, followed by the Emancipation Act of 1833, which forbade slave ownership. Of course, this wasn't the end of slavery everywhere. The United States banned slavery in 1865 after a brutal civil war that broke the country in half. Cuba went slave-free in 1866, Brazil in 1888, and in West African countries, it was only in the late 1920s that slavery was finally outlawed. In all of these countries, though, the scars that slavery left behind still affect their societies, and in places like the United States, a deep divide still splinters the nation. But if you think slavery is a thing of the past and that the world today no longer holds slaves, you're actually very, very wrong. slavery is still a thing today. Human rights activists emphasize that this fight is actually far from over. It is estimated that today there are over 27 million slaves worldwide, which sadly means that we have more slaves today than at any other point in history. And this number might actually be a low estimate. Reputed organizations like the International Labour Organization, Walk Free, and the International Organization for Migration suggested that in 2022 there were actually around 50 million slaves worldwide. Of these individuals, around half are people who are subjected to forced labor, and the rest are women and children forced into marriages or trafficked for the sex industry, and children and young boys who are being abducted to force them to fight as soldiers. Officially, slavery is no longer allowed, but in reality this is a bigger problem than ever before. And for some weird reason I can't understand, no one seems to care. I hope this video was interesting enough to have inspired you to look into it further on your own. If you liked it, leave a like and subscribe. You can leave your comments downstairs, and you can also check out my Patreon page if you want to support me. I do hope to see you next time. Bye.